Hello, my name is Jason Kennedy, and this is my oral presentation on the trade restrictions between Australia and China. An overview on the presentation below. Point 1, we'll start on a background between the trade disputes between Australia and China. Point 2, we'll critically analyse the trade dispute between the two countries. Then we'll move on to a discussion on the implications on the Australian industries between the trades. Fourth, we move on to recommendations for the future of the trade between the two countries, Australia and China. A background on the trade between Australia and China in the past. In 2014, Australia and China agreed to describe their relationship as comprehensive strategic partnerships between the two nations. Followed closely by in December 2015, the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, was signed between the two nations, allowing free trade between Australia and China, a beneficial agreement between the two countries. The free trade agreement was beneficial for both countries, Australia and China, with China locking in energy and raw materials for their booming manufacturing industry, and Australia providing large amounts of exports to China. Australia and China historically have a large trade partnership, with China being Australia's largest two-way trading partner, accounting for 31% of our trade within the world. However, trade between the two countries declined by 3% in 2020. Tariff restrictions placed on Australia in 2020 resulted in a loss of exports of 7% in 2020. Now we'll look at some national differences, starting off with the political differences. Australia is a parliamentary democracy, looking at individualism, freedom for individuals, political and economic pursuits. However, China is communist and values collectivism, pushes collective goals over individual goals. Next, we look at the national differences in their economies. Australia operates a mixed market economy, which means their economy is determined by the market. China, on the other hand, operates a command economy, where the government makes decisions for production and investment on behalf of the country for the country. The legal differences between Australia and China, starting off with Australia, liberal. The legal protection for individuals is similar to most Western countries and is very strong. However, in China, the communitarian, where individuals have lower legal rights than individuals in Western nations like Australia. Now we'll look at a timeline breakdown of the relationship between Australia and China. Impacts in 2020. In April 2020, Australia called for an independent inquiry into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic and where it started. This quickly angered China, who retaliated 1 week later with threats of consumer boycotts. In May 2020, China responded with anti-dumping tariffs on Australian barley. Then in May 2020, Australia accused China of economic coercion shortly after the tariffs were implemented on Australian barley. China then responded by decertifying 4 major beef exports to China, where a few months later, they added an additional decertification, making it 5 in total. Next, there's growing strain between the two countries over the independent inquiry and the tariffs placed on the exports within Australia. In August 2020, China imposed anti-dumping investigations into Australian wine exports, one of the largest exports into China. Then the Chinese government followed on by warning tourists and students not to travel to Australia. Implications on Australian industries. First, we'll start off with barley. Anti-dumping tariffs on 80.5% of barley exports were implemented, effectively ending the exports of barley to China, which at the time was a $1.2 billion industry, which has now been lost. The barley exports industry in Australia is now looking to alternatives and providing exports to countries like India. Next, we'll move on to beef. China has suspended the licenses of beef exports to five in total. These 5 beef exporters produced 1/3 of Australia's beef exports. This industry is worth $1 billion total in beef exports. And Australia at the time was China's largest beef importer, where now after the decertification of Australian beef exports, we have now moved to 4th biggest exporter on China's. Next, we move to wine. China placed investigations into Australia's wine market, which forced Chinese importers of wine to move away from Australian markets. These fears were built through a 202% fear of tariffs, which would make their wine unsellable in the country, shrinking a $1.2 billion export market over the following 12 to 18 months. Next, we move to education. Chinese students made up 38% of full-paying students before the tariffs and COVID-19. Chinese officials warned Chinese students against Australian education for fears of incidents and discrimination. Before the tariffs were implemented and the Chinese government warned off students, the Chinese education market in Australia has decreased by 20%. This reduction has also been contributed to by COVID-19. Some recommendations on the future trade between Australia and China. Political, high-level diplomatic reconciliation of governments. At the moment, the communication between the governments at a high diplomatic level have ceased. For the trade negotiations for the trade between the two countries, these negotiations at a higher level will need to be improved. Tariffs placed on Australia for exports of barley, wine, beef, and education and tourism will need to be reviewed between the two countries. This may need mediation from the World Trade Organization. A recommendation to work towards solidifying CAFTA again, the free trade agreement between Australia and China, which would implement and solidify a strong future of trade between the two countries. Renew faith between country citizens to improve tourism and education. Once the diplomatic reconciliation has been completed, China can reassure its citizens that Australia is a safe place to travel and receive higher education. Improve communication between the countries to minimize long-term damage. We need a high-level diplomatic reconciliation, but we also need low-level communication between the two countries to ensure tariffs and trade barriers do not occur in the future and no one is shocked. Please find my reference list attached. Thank you for taking the time.